Hey everybody, friendly neighborhood game master Zach Hall here. One thing you might not know about me, I grew up a huge Star Trek nerd. I was raised in a pretty religious household growing up, and so the types of media I could see was pretty limited. But the one thing that was kind of popular that I could watch as a kid was something that was one of my dad's absolute favorites, and it was Star Trek. Really, next gen. Next gen Star Trek was one of the really one of the things that like I fell in love with very early on. Probably started watching consistently on VHS tapes that my dad would take empty VHS tapes and record episodes on them, like commercials intact and everything. And that's how I watched a lot of the show. I would eventually start renting VHS tapes from my local library. Had a huge collection of them, was like either 2 or 3 episodes on a single VHS tape, and I could rent them out for a couple days at a time, take them home and watch them. Feel incredibly lucky that I had both of those resources available to me. And it was really the thing I consistently watched a lot of. I've talked, and I think on this channel, I've mentioned multiple times, including on my kind of recent 5e alternative, on my 5e alternative video, the 2D20 system from Odysseus. And I don't know if Star Trek Adventures was the first ever 2D20 system. I think Conan came out really before then, but Star Trek Adventures is probably what put Modiphius and the system, their in-house 2D system on the map. It's popular. I will admit, I don't know if it's completely still supported. I think it is. I think I just got an email about a lower deck supplement from Odysseus, though I do think they're not doing as many printed material nowadays, kind of going all digital with PTFs, and it's hard to blame anybody. But the Star Trek Adventures core rulebook came out 2017, uses a very cool system that I really like, the Modiphius in-house 2D20 system. They've just recently, in the past 6 months or so, started releasing and creating SRD content for that 2D20 system so that other game designers and fans can start creating content of their own using that 2D20 system, which I think is a huge win because I think it's really, really great. And I wanted to kind of start looking, kind of doing my thing, looking through the rulebook for the Star Trek Adventures. Now, this is not my first look through it. I have previously read through the rulebook. I own a physical copy. I've looked through the PDF before, but I've never really had the intention of running or playing in it because I don't know any other Trekkies in my life. Outside of my family members, like my dad and my brothers do not love Star Trek as much as I do. But like we could get by trying to like play it. And Star Trek, I think, is one of those settings that I do think you have to be a fan of before you can just jump into the tabletop RPG of it. And maybe I'm wrong. I would love to hear from anybody who has played in a Star Trek Adventures game that wasn't already like some level of exposed to Star Trek. I feel like in order to make it feel like Star Trek, you kind of have to have that context. I guess it'd be similar to someone jumping into like the high fantasy of D&D without having any exposure to that genre. That's less likely just because the genre is so well established that even just through cultural, zeitgeisty type stuff, you get some exposure to that level high fantasy, where Star Trek is it's sci-fi, but it's a very specific flavor of sci-fi that's not everybody's cup of tea. Completely fine. But Star Trek Adventures has two huge wins for me. It allows me to play in one of my favorite IPs, and 2, what often doesn't happen when an IP gets created into a tabletop role-playing game, the system is actually really good. It's really good. So we're gonna do that today. I'm gonna just crack open the PDF. This is probably who knows. I don't want to spend a lot of time on flavor, on setting stuff. Like, you should just go get the PDF. I'll put a link to the Modiphius store to the PDF for the core rulebook that you can buy. I'm sure it's also available on like Drive-Thru RPG, that kind of stuff, if you like having everything in one place. But yeah, let's just dive into it. Dive into it, see what happens. This is the Star Trek Adventures core rulebook. I wonder if it includes. I mean, it's got all this, like the art and illustrations and the stuff is really cool. The fun thing about Star Trek is that it's been around for so long and came out in a time where people really did, like, it was pop culture, for especially during the original series and when those movies were coming out in the 70s and 80s. I mean, this was pop culture. And so they were selling all kinds of supplements, specifically like technical supplements. And if you look at them, it's obvious that the people working on the show, the original series and the movies, cared deeply about creating a consistent system for the TV show itself. I've heard stories about the show Bible for Star Trek, the original series, and for Next Gen being extensive. They have internal reference material to tell you, like, what does a ship model look like? When was it first created? Who's it named after? Has it had retrofits previously? It's kind of amazing, right? And I think the TTRPG definitely benefits from that, because the world already has this existing tech spec, but then the RPG just kind of has to convert into like a game system, right? Which all in all, like, probably not that difficult. It would be more difficult to take something that isn't as technical. A little, like, I'm thinking of a recent popular IP got turned into a RPG, Avatar: The Last Airbender. I do have that around. It used Powered by the Apocalypse, I think. Yeah. So, but that's the one thing where, like, okay, like, we don't really know. That's not a hard system. Like, the hard power, the magic system of Airbender is not, like, it's not a hard system. Kind of hard to, like, quantify. And in reality, like, the main character of the show, the main protagonist, like, he's meant to be OP. Both that, like, the Avatar is meant to be OP. So, like, balancing issues and how do we convert this into a story with, like, a party and stuff like that. Like, things you have to consider. All that is easily built into Star Trek. Like, absolutely a IP and a storytelling thing, like a story being told that I think pretty easily converts to tabletop. The difficulty with Star Trek and running Star Trek Adventures is making it feel authentic in moments where the player knows significantly less than their character. That's probably the hardest part. Now that I'm like while I'm here, I guess let's talk about it. When you play Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, there's obviously moments where your character knows more than you, the player. Usually when dealing with people, dealing with cities, towns, and maybe then, like, the characters sometimes will know more when, like, we're talking about, like, a 3D, like, as a player, there's an inherent limitation on, like, things that you see and are aware of based on, like, faulty information or miscommunication or didn't think to ask. But there's stuff that your character would inherently know when things in, like, combat and encounter mode, that kind of stuff, right? But that tends to not happen too often, or when it does, it's heavily outweighed by all the times that it didn't really matter if your character knew something, or it's a quick proper noun and explanation of a thing that your GM gives you, and everybody moves on with their day, like, totally fine. Star Trek, it is in these already existing worlds. If you aren't a big fan, it can be, or even if you are a really big fan, like if you know what Memory Alpha is, then you're a big Star Trek fan probably. And even then, there's going to be situations where your character is going to know so much more than you that there's going to be a bit of a learning curve in terms of, I think the players have to get over and understand that the GM is going to have to dictate and tell you a lot of things in a Star Trek Adventures game. And I could absolutely see a player coming to a Star Trek Adventures game and realizing, oh shit, like it's so hard. Like I don't even know how to solve that problem. I just need the ability to roll and like, GM, can you tell me solutions? Because like you just described this alien thing. I'm going to do my best to understand and communicate in a language that, like, a shared language and understanding that you, the GM, and me, the player, have. But like there has to be a lot of leniency for the GM to know, like, hey, like, and as the GM, like normally the advice in a D&D and Pathfinder type game is like, do not come up with solutions for your players. Just put hazards, put traps, put dangerous situations in their path, and then learn to grow comfortable with being in the moment with them and adjudicating their decisions that they make with, like, into the game system, into the game rules. But don't pre-create solutions for them, because then they might miss out on an opportunity. You might feel like you did all this prep for just them to then skip it because they came up with a great plan and rolled well. You as a GM might feel a little slighted by like all this work that went to waste. That's why the general dungeon master suggestions is don't create solutions. Star Trek Adventures, I think you as a GM might have to come up with the solutions. If you're not running a published adventure, and I have not read a published adventure, maybe that's something we can do here on the channel too, like in this playlist, in this series, is like, I'm going to have to come up with some solutions, or I'm going to have to be really on it with my knowledge of the game and of the world to where I can say something that seems plausible. Because what you don't want to have to do is, like, the player doesn't know, the GM doesn't really know. We've entered into this area of complete improvisation, and it doesn't sound or feel like Star Trek, where like a player just is rolling because we know the stats and the attributes they should roll. The GM knows how difficult it may be. Maybe they're guessing, but like nothing is really being said. There's no in-world information being shared. It's just a roll to overcome a thing. Like, and that would feel really bad. But I could see that becoming a pitfall of Star Trek Adventures, where like the barrier of entry running a Star Trek Adventures game is much higher than running a D&D or a Pathfinder game, just because of that incredibly specific in-world knowledge that I think at least the GM has to know. Huge aside later, the actual PDF. I actually, as a neurodivergent person who does actually really struggle with the normal, like, light day mode black text on white background, I love that the rulebook is dark pages with white text for the most part. There's moments of low contrast, but gosh, does it just make it so much easier on me to read. And not everybody's going to feel that way, which is why they've got printer friendly versions of the PDF that goes back, that are like, it wasn't just like a script migration. I think they did a totally separate layout where it's white text and your standard your standard white background, or at least light background with dark text over it. Illustrations are so freaking good. So Star Trek Star Trek Adventures default setting is the 24th century. I think it even comes down here to say 2371, which is I don't know when. I'd have to look up when the 20. Oh, here we go. So the Enterprise is off to the Amargosa Observatory. I do remember that episode. And then Voyager is about to go out on their mission to the Badlands. And the Defiant has just been assigned to Deep Space Nine. So this is all happening in right when basically the three main shows of the 90s were all kind of converging. The Amargosa Observatory is during the Generations film. Deep Space Nine is in the middle of its series run, couple seasons in, but still has a couple seasons left. Voyager is about to start. Obviously, a pretty popular place to start, since I'm sure they kind of knew our audience for Star Trek Adventures, a tabletop role-playing game of Star Trek, is probably not people who watched the J.J. Abrams film series, fell in love with Chris Pine, and picked it up. Like this is probably folks who watched Next Generation and like the heyday of Star Trek in the 90s. And remember, this book came out in 2017, so this is before the like new era of Star Trek, run by Alec Kurtzman on Paramount Plus, where you've got Picard, Discovery, Strange New World. Man, I could go into no, just to say I like new Star Trek. Let me just get that out of the way. If you don't, that's completely fine. Not a problem. Don't blame anybody. If it's not your cup of tea, it doesn't feel like Star Trek to you, completely fine. I do like it. Strange New Worlds is the best Star Trek I've seen since Deep Space Nine, I think. It's incredibly good. And but at the same time, just so you know, I'm a Voyager boy. I grew up on Voyager. Voyager was the show, like probably the first TV show that I watched live week to week on UPN with my parents' rabbit ears. Loved it. I know people have strong opinions on it, don't think it was that good, especially people that loved Deep Space Nine, were like, I didn't experience Deep Space Nine until I was an adult. I do know enough about this rulebook that you can basically play in any era that you would like to, as long as you're willing to get flexible. I also know that there's a great community creating homebrew for the system to expand on the setting, giving you options. For me, I'm the weirdo that kind of wants to like move the timeline up as far as I can into like new stuff to where I don't have to necessarily worry about the existing canon. And that's usually true for me whenever I do gaming inside of an IP. It's like, okay, we're either like, I don't really like alternative universe stuff. Either I'm going to do the work to like, if it's a big part of the gaming group's interest where they're going to interface and work with and be kind of alongside pre-existing characters and storylines that they already are familiar with, then okay, if that's a big part of it, I will do the work to try to make sure we're as canon compliant as possible. Otherwise, let me skip ahead so that we can kind of create our own story and like and then I can fill in fun Easter eggs if necessary, if like as we want to do. This rulebook assumes you are playing in Starfleet. There is an additional there's an entirely different rulebook for playing in the Klingon Empire. I don't know if Romulans get their own rulebook or if they have like a section in the Klingon one. Unclear, though I'm sure it works fairly similarly. So the dice in Star Trek Adventures is a little different in that it is, you're going to use your 2d20, multiple 2d20s. You need kind of a pool of them, and then you're going to need a pool of d6s, and that's kind of it. You can see here in this illustration, you've got your character sheet, your dice, 2d20s, and then these blue and red chips. That is a really cool game mechanic that I really love, that it's called momentum and threat. I think it's really, really great. I really love it as a system in terms of a shared resource that the party can manage and use to kind of move things along. And also a GM resource, which is really, really cool. I like it a lot. And I think it gives players and GM an extra option when the dice do something kind of gnarly and you don't want to ruin the storytelling. Now that might not be your cup of tea. Like if you're a dice deity type person, like, hey, the dice dictate everything. Like, don't fudge rolls. The dice are kind of God when it comes to the storytelling element. Like, I would rather sacrifice the verisimilitude. Gosh, I can't say that word. The truthiness feeling, the honest feeling of our storytelling. I'd rather sacrifice that in order to make the dice the bearer of truth. If you're that type of person, I would encourage you to try something new. Of like, while this isn't a like story first role playing game, it's not crunchy, but like you have attributes, you have disciplines, you have skills, you level up, you gain talents, you can spec out your starship. There's math involved and it matters, but it also helps to treat Star Trek Adventures as like an improv, and you want the the story of the episode to make sense. And it's up to the GM to make sure that like a whole arc, a season, if you will, makes sense. Ideally, they're putting, you know, I mean, you can go anywhere from the straight episodic nature of like Next Generation, where like you're really only, each episode kind of handles its own thing. The status quo returns to its previous state at the end of the episode 95 times out of 100. You're really there for character development, and you know, eventually there might be occasional set pieces that move the setting along. You could do that, or you could go Deep Space Nine later seasons where, you know, each episode's building on itself and there's A plots and B plots and C plots, and that's kind of up to the GM to do, but it's up to the players to make the episode, each session, make sense. And this is a system that lets you not let the dice get in the way of that if you want to, which I think is great. Man, I really love the art style for this. Really, like, I can't speak to like necessarily layout of like how the information is laid out. I do know that for like the first almost 50-60 pages is almost all setting information and flavor, but like we said, this is a pretty setting. I mean, it's a setting. It's an IP with an existing setting. Everybody who wants to play the game is coming because it has a pre-existing setting, which means you kind of have to be aware of the setting. Man, but the illustrations, so good. So this is some information on like current state of affairs inside of the Alpha Quadrant, which is the main, where most of the storylines happen. It's where it's where Starfleet and the Federation are. It's where the Klingon Empire is, Romulan Empire is. This is just past the Deep Space Nine has just become aware of the Delta or the Beta Quadrant, and then Voyager is about to get thrown into the Delta Quadrant, but it's basically isolated the entire time. I believe the Shackleton Expanse is basically where they expect Star Trek Adventures stories to happen. I think they did like a living campaign for like a single season, and it for the most part was taking place in the Shackleton Expanse, which has, I don't know, it was not created for Star Trek Adventures, but I believe it was just kind of briefly mentioned, unless I'm totally blanking. Like it could be a big set piece that I'm just kind of forgetting about in like a later season that I'm blanking on, but like existed in the canon before the game, but was pretty much a blank slate. And Star Trek Adventures kind of took that as like, okay, here's a playground where we can do stuff that isn't going to mess with like the canon, since they like the assumed default timeline is like literally in the middle of shows running. Like you don't want the unless you're trying to do like an alternate universe type game, most people aren't out there trying to like change the story of how Star Trek laid out. Early history, like I said, these illustrations and the layout is so cool. I mean, even if you're just a Star Trek nerd and aren't really looking to play the game, what a cool resource that assumes nothing, went through professional editing, got CBS, like Paramount approval. All this stuff is accurate to the canon. Like you should just pick up the PDF, even if you're just a Star Trek fan. Like, yeah, like only the first, like a big chunk of the book isn't going to be good, like necessarily like useful for you. I mean, it's a really cool resource. We got Wolf 359, Gul Kalane, which is a Cardassian character from Deep Space Nine. Wolf 359 was in like the battle that the Enterprise missed out on in Star Trek First Contact. See, all this stuff is so cool to me. Like, look at this, like this, I mean, it doesn't mean anything, but like, it's just, I don't know. This is the kind of nerdy stuff I get really nerdy about. So like, listen, we're on page 52, first 50 pages, all flavor setting stuff. And we're continuing into, we've got the official insignia for Starfleet Command. We've got the rank pins, Prime Directive with awesome art. We've got multiple in-universe writings about things like the Prime Directive from multiple viewpoints. I mean, obviously fiction created for the book. These are not characters I recognize. I'm assuming they just kind of invented them, but still really cool. The mission of Starfleet, some background on what you would have experienced going through Starfleet Academy. Now we're getting into like departments, because you will pick a department, and that's basically like your class. You've got the command department, science department, and tactical/security department, at least in Starfleet. And those are basically your classes, and then you kind of specialize inside of those, which is just so flippin' cool. Talk about like your duties, away teams, different kinds of mission. You can go on diplomacy, first contact, patrol, aid and relief, awesome double page art, transporter, beacons. This character is getting teleported out in the middle of a planet or moon getting destroyed. Awesome. Look at this kind of elderly Klingon science officer. Like I said, you should just get this if you like Star Trek. Got a schematic for a runabout. Like, this is all literally just telling you like the kinds of things that your characters could be doing. Also love this, the science guy scanning this obvious like alien technology or artifact, operations guy who's looking on, and a security guy who's literally having to hold this what looks like a stone door on his shoulders to make sure the door doesn't stay closed. That sounds about right. Here's a Galaxy class, most famous, the flagship of the Starfleet, USS Enterprise, designation 1701 D. We do get E in the later movies. There's that same guy. So cool. So here's how, like, we're in chapter 4. The beginning of chapter 4, page 73 is when we first start getting a look at the setting. Or like, excuse me, not the setting, the actual rules. So we have dice, and this is kind of a dice pool system, though you are usually starting out with 2 d20s. And then, like I said earlier, you got the d6s. There's a third die, was a challenge dice. So you can buy, it's basically a d6, and they tell you how to, if you don't want to buy the special challenge die from Modiphius, you can just use a normal d6. They've got the like result table over here, but it's basically like it's either a 0, 1, 2 or an effect, which kind of comes into play when wanting to like activate special abilities for your character or for your ship. Basic operations, aka how you play the game. You got scenes, serves as the building blocks of an ongoing story, and a framework within which characters act and react to situations. Some scenes called encounters are more structured and make greater use of the rules, typically where they deal with a conflict between 2 or more sides. Traits, advantages, and complications, which serve to describe scenes, locations, situations, and characters. This is similar to like if you've ever played Fate or seen or like engaged with the Fate system at all, where there's like actual adjective descriptors for scenes that the characters can interact with. It's also a system available in Star Trek Adventures, though I think there is a pretty popular and like, I mean, famous, that's not the right word. No actual play except for maybe 2 in the whole world is famous. But there was on the old Geek and Sundry network, there was a Star Trek Adventures actual play that was incredibly well done. I really enjoyed it. And I'm drawing a blank on what it was called. Their ship was the USS Sally Ride, named after the first American woman into space. Or maybe she wasn't the first, but she just at one point held the record for the longest amount of time spent in space. I'm now drawing a blank and feel bad. They had a sequel show after Geek and Sundry went under called Clear Skies. Shield of Tomorrow. That was the name of the first actual play that they kind of got that group started and did. I thought was really, really well done. If you're interested in watching a Star Trek Adventures actual play, if you can find Shield of Tomorrow on YouTube, I highly recommend checking it out. There is from that same GM, and a lot of the same players picked up and went independent and had a series called Clear Skies, which was, like I said, done independently. They played a little bit before the COVID pandemic began and then had to go digital for a while. And I don't think the production on Shields of Tomorrow was really good. Like, they had a budget, you know what I mean? But the Clear Skies was hurt by just bad audio, which is something I can't stand. If you note my videos, the videos incredibly basic. But I really care about how they sound. And I've put in a lot of time and effort, money even, to make sure that my videos sound good. And when I did podcasts, I want to make sure they sounded really good. Even if they weren't edited great, leaving ums in and silences and stuff, it's got to sound good. And I feel like the same can be said for most actual plays. Clear Skies suffered from kind of bad audio for a lot of it. Made it really hard with like crosstalk and understanding people. Shield of Tomorrow was really good, but they didn't really do this, the scene traits. They didn't really interact with that system all that much, and it did not hurt the game at all, I don't think. Man, my ADHD is just really killing it today. Lots of tangents. I apologize. I might actually have to like create chapters on this one. So if you can skip tangents of mine. So you got momentum, which is generated by players when they succeed well at tasks, and which can be used to improve their chances subsequently. So think of, how much I love a range of success or failure. Something that I did not like when playing D&D 5th edition is that it was like a binary state of you either succeed at something or you fail at something, unless you roll a natural 20 and then you really succeed at something. And even then, that's kind of a homebrew rule. Now, a lot of DMs in 5e will kind of start homebrewing ranges of success, degrees of success. And a lot of that's just kind of gut feeling. I feel like I see a lot of D&D 5e DMs ask for a roll without having a set DC in mind, and just kind of let the dice speak to them in like this kind of gut instinct kind of way, which is something I didn't particularly like. How that's different in Pathfinder 2e with like, okay, no longer is a critical success just in encounter mode and only when you roll a natural 20. Now it's a crit success for, multiple areas of the game. And if you get 10 above the DC, then it's a critical success. Momentum is kind of similar in where like there might be, there's probably going to be an additional effect that happens immediately that you can choose to use. Or you just have this pool of resource that like, if you really succeed at something, then you can add momentum to your resource pool and use that resource later to make things even better for you. This definitely I think this worked great for a IP in a game trying to mimic an IP that is like began as fiction. Things like plot armor probably should be a thing in a Star Trek game, unless you want to take that away. And then you just you can play around with the systems to kind of remove that. But if you're playing a nitty gritty Star Trek game, I have questions. Who hurt you, first of all? Star Trek is supposed to be this kind of like positive, hopeful sci-fi, science fantasy almost. And plot armor for characters is kind of a big part of that. And so momentum kind of helps with that. Threat then is a similar pool of resources that the GM gets to use to create complications for players. So if a player rolls really, really poorly on the dice, they can choose to succeed at cost. They can opt into it. And if they opt into it, they can successfully do what they were going to do, but there might be a story consequence that maybe doesn't infect them mechanically, but might make things more difficult for them, or it took them longer to do the task than they expected. But they could also add threat to the game master's like threat pool, which then the GM can use to increase the range of complications, increase how actual difficulty of the task. Because the GM kind of gets to pull this lever when they want, the GM gets to they put their finger on the game a lot, and it's kind of up to them. There has to be this trust between the players and the GM, but it also lets the GM kind of create the game that they want with the stakes as high as they want, which I think is great. I think it's great specifically for Star Trek, but I think there's a lot of IPs where this system could be big of use. And maybe it's just because it's sci-fi that I think I'm connecting the two. I think something like The Expanse could be not easily adapted, but could totally be adapted into the 2D20 system and do really well. I mean, it's still a big homebrew project, but not like the biggest homebrew project I've ever heard of. So enough traits. Gosh, that's so, look at that. y'all. It's so good. Let's read this section on technobabble because I think it kind of ties into something I talked about earlier. Episodes of Star Trek often include technobabble, complicated sounding dialogue that describes fictional scenes or technology, often to explain a plot development or a solution to a problem, or simply to add detail to a situation. The sheer bewildering variety of possible technobabble makes it difficult to cover extensively. However, conveniently enough, traits and both advantages and complications are extremely useful representing the kinds of things that technobabble represents. For the sake of consistency, keep note of traits that represent technobabble so that they can be referenced later. And I think this is, I mean, I love that they kind of call out technobabble, absolutely a thing in science fiction like Star Trek, where it is equal parts science fiction, equal parts fantasy, I think, compared to something like Star Wars, where it's like 15% science fiction and 85% fantasy. On the flip side of that, speaking of the Expanse being like, I mean, all it's plausible, know what I mean? So like, let's call it like 95% science fiction, 5% fantasy. Then you have tasks, which is basically like, as you imagine, coming from a like Pathfinder 2e background, these are not only your combats, but also like your hazards, traps, things like that, which is why like Pathfinder, we call it encounters. Tasks kind of covers the gamut of the whole shebang. So getting down into the nitty gritty of a character, you have attributes, disciplines, and focuses. A character has 6 attributes: control, daring, fitness, insight, presence, and reason. Might feel pretty comfortable to you if you're coming from like D20 background. You also have 6 disciplines: command, con, engineering, security, science, and medicine, which cover the character's training and expertise. So like attributes is like your innate capabilities, ranges from 7 to 12, and then disciplines, which covers your training and expertise, and they go from 1 to 5, which I think is really great. I love that breakdown, especially in a world of legitimately like different races. We obviously don't want to lean too hard into like bioessentialism, but at the same time, like literally a different race from a different planet with a completely different like evolutionary makeup, wide ranging array of attributes. While obviously, you know, if what a race's average or usual doesn't fit your specific character, you just change it. Not a huge deal. You also have focuses, which are categories of speciality representing specialized training and practical experience in specific fields. Focuses do not have a specific rating of their own. Then for any given task, character will combine a single attribute, a single discipline, and may use a single focus to establish the target number. So when you are attempting a task and it invokes your attributes, disciplines, and focuses, it requires rolling 2 or more d20s. So the game master chooses which attribute and which discipline are appropriate for the task being attempted, as well if any of the character's focuses are applicable. This might be stated by the rules, or the player might suggest a combination. The game master has the final say. Add together the attribute and the discipline chosen. This is the target number for the task. So I love, when I've seen this work the best is when it's a conversation between the game master and the player. The game master describes like whatever is stopping the PC from achieving what they're wanting to achieve. The player describes how their character reacts in universe and world, and then the game master decides what the attribute and discipline combo are that best represents that player's choice of how to overcome. And like I said, like some of these are easily to say by rules. Those are usually in like a very specific hazard, or in combat there's a specific attribute and discipline pairing that you would need to roll. But in a lot of instances, like there's going to be scenes and episodes of Star Trek that you are not in like combat with NPCs or combatants. So a lot of it is interacting with an environment. So you get that target number. Remember, so your attributes 7 to 12, disciplines 1 to 5. So ranges could be as low as 8 or as high as 17. Then the game master sets difficulty. Normally any number from 0 to 5, but in extreme cases can go higher. Some tasks may have a default difficulty listed in the rules, but circumstances may affect those difficulties. The difficulty is the number of successes that the player must roll on their d20s to successfully complete the task. Player takes 2d20s, can purchase additional d20s by spending momentum, adding threat, or using determination, which is like another cool kind of plot armor type thing. Once additional die have been purchased, if any, the player rolls their dice pool. The die roll needs to roll equal or less than the target number to score a single success. So say the target number ended up being 14 and you're trying to roll lower than that. Like, huge opportunity of success there, a lot more than what you might be used to when playing a different D20 game. Now, obviously, like, the GM has a lot of say in of by increasing the difficulty. You know, my exposure to the game through actual plays, most stuff was like 2 difficulty or less, which can be achieved. And depending on, you know, how, if a character was attempting something that they're already really good at and specialized at, I mean, you know, you're in Star Trek, you're wanting your characters to shine and succeed, right? Obviously, the failure is where the tension is, which is where a GM managed resource like threat can be so useful in creating tension without necessarily causing the players to fail. You know, it is a delicate balancing act that I think requires trust, patience, and a bit of a learning curve. But I really, really do love this system. I think it's a pretty simple dice resolution system for what ends up being a complicated array of options for resolution, which I think should be most game designers' goal. You know, lots of options on the table without having to be crazily complicated in figuring out what to actually do to create the result, like resolve the stuff. And obviously you've got equipment and technology that can help with things, complications. These are things that the game master can use in order to, like I was talking about, ratchet up the tension in an episode. Is like, okay, like, we know what success looks like if you roll low on these, but if you roll high, something bad could really happen. A natural 20 in Star Trek Adventures is bad news. It's usually automatically a complication. Target number's 12. You're good everything 12 and under. If you roll a 1, I think it counts as 2 successes, something like that. But if you roll a 20, then that's a complication. At, you know, best case scenario, the GM decides to just add some threat to their threat pool, and you might have to deal with the consequences later. At worst, like, something really bad has happened. Not only did you fail at the attempt that you were the task you were trying to succeed at, but you really shot the bed. Things went really, really badly. And then, like we kind of mentioned, momentum can be saved to purchase extra dice. So if you have a plethora of momentum, you really want to make sure that you succeed on this task. Even if the difficulty is just 1 or 2, you're giving yourself an extra dice just to, you know, really make sure that you're going to hit that difficulty mark to succeed at the task. Purchase extra dice with momentum. Or it almost becomes a requirement if you're attempting a really difficult task, like a difficulty of 4. Unless you're going to critically succeed and get 2 successes per die, you're going to have to purchase additional dice to even just baseline succeed at the task. So momentum becomes a resource, kind of similar to hero points in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where if you don't really pay attention, you all of a sudden have a lot of it and kind of need to start using it in certain ways. But if you start using it all willy-nilly when you don't really need to try to like boost your odds, you could really miss out on, you know, get to a place where you really actually need it and then not have it available to you. Common uses for momentum is to create an advantage. You can spend 2 momentum to create a new advantage in a scene. You can create opportunities for yourself. You can create a problem for somebody else's task. Or really incredibly useful in Star Trek, obtaining information. Thinking of recall knowledge rolls in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or really lots of skill checks in D&D can be used for this. But like we talked about earlier, like, there's a lot of in-game knowledge that your character knows that the player doesn't. How you get access to some of that character knowledge is rolling well on simple tasks and then using momentum to be able to ask additional questions of the game master, which I think is just really, really great. And then you've got threat, which can you can add additional complications. So instead of just a 20 being a complication, you can spend threat to increase that complication range to include more numbers, 18, 19, 20. Or it can basically be used like exactly like momentum for NPCs that the game master is. Then have determination. Player characters begin each season, so like a story arc with a point of determination. No character can have more than 3, and it's tied to using your values. So like during character creation, you basically establish what are the values of this individual, this person that I am playing. And if you come into an extremely dire or important situation and what you're dealing with happens to intersect with one of your values, you can lean into that value, use a point of determination, and give yourself this huge boost in making sure that you succeed. But it also can kind of work the other way. If you're trying to do something that runs against your values, it can be used against you by the GM, which is, I think, really, really cool. So if you've got a value of, like, let's say you're playing the captain and you have a value like always goes down with his ship, and you're in this extremely dire situation and you're rolling basically to see like, can I save this ship in like its last moment of need or not? Or convincing someone to leave them alone while I, the captain, stay alone on the bridge to make a last gasp effort to save us. Like that kind of ties into that value that you can then use to like give yourself advantage and momentum, which is really cool. And then there's some extended stuff like challenges, which is, you know, multiple tasks in a row, extended tasks, a single task that takes a long time and multiple roles, etc. Rules for that, which is great because obviously comes up a lot in Star Trek stuff. I'm gonna stop here. Chapters 1 through 4 of Star Trek Adventures. Obviously, most of that was flavor that we just kind of looked at some pretty art for, but we got the basics of how the system works and how dice resolution works. And next we'll take a look at like what the character creation stuff looks like in chapter 5. One thing I love about character creation has this life path system where you basically like can basically create a backstory at the same time that you are creating your character, or flip side, you've created a backstory and you pick what matches, and you get to see all the mechanical benefits and changes to your character based on the backstory that you already created. It works both ways. I think it's great, especially for a system like Star Trek Adventures, where you're playing usually close to a fully realized person. You can play like a young, fresh out of the academy person, player, or excuse me, fresh out of the academy character. It still needs to grow and stuff, where there's like things still waiting to happen to them. But you can also play like middle-aged commanders who have been in Starfleet for a decade, 2 decades, and have already experienced some stuff, and that can be represented and shown on your character sheet, which I love. I think it's great. Star Trek Adventures does no problem recognizing the fact that not everybody in a party is going to be equally balanced, because like the staff of a starship in what is realistically a military situation is not the same. You're going to have players of varying levels. So we're going to see that represented in the character sheet when we pick up chapter 5, reporting for duty, character creation, Star Trek Adventures from Modifius. If you like this video, leave a like. Tell me if you've played Star Trek Adventures or just a Trekkie yourself, have picked this up. What's your favorite thing or a story from one of your games that's happened in Star Trek Adventures? Would love to hear it. If you'd love to see me explore more of Star Trek Adventures stuff, happy to do it. Love the layout, love the art design. I legitimately do love the system and wish I had more opportunities to actually, and who knows, like if enough people are interested, maybe we get a little like YouTube community Star Trek Adventures game going. I'd be down. So let me know in the comments if any of that stuff interests you. Thanks so much for watching the channel. If you are interested at all at TTRPGs and hearing a nerd talk deeply about them, you should subscribe to this channel, because that's basically all I do. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time. Peace.